And thank you for having me on. This has become my life's mission and passion to get this information out because it was such a game changer for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's going to be a game changer for some people listening here too. So kind of the way this all started was as a child, I just single focused on going to medical school. So I had identified that when I was 6. And,
Okay.
I was a geek when I was a kid. And that's important because it's like, I was so driven for that and just poured myself into it. So instead of going and playing with kids, I was studying when I was 12, 13, 14, already thinking about what it's going to take to get into medical school. My family moved out to the country and into an old farmhouse. And I grew up playing in the fields and bitten by ticks all the time. Also, we didn't know, but that farmhouse was full of toxic mold. And I lived there for 10 years before I moved out. And my health just started going downhill after we moved there. So I was breaking out in hives. I was scratching my skin at night until I bled because I was just so itchy all the time. My eyes were itching. I would sneeze all the time. And it just kind of snowballed. I started having a lot of blood sugar issues to where I had to eat. Eventually I had to eat every 2 to 3 hours or I'd start to black out. And nobody could put the picture together. So I was seeing all of these specialists. Nobody could figure me out. And I got to college. I pushed my way through college and overachieving crashed totally. So I did not make it to medical school, which was one of the most devastating things for me. And I had to figure out what else I was going to do with my life. So I became a chronically ill patient instead of the physician I wanted to be. And I exhausted traditional medicine and had so many people tell me that everything was in my head. I had people tell me I was attached to being sick. There was something I was getting out of it, which is just not just demoralizing, but traumatic. And I know so many people have had those experiences, especially around their thyroid. You know something's wrong. They say the markers look normal, but something's wrong. And it took a very long time to finally figure out. First, I landed on histamine intolerance. And I landed on that because I was, again, dedicated to my health. And I was trying to do all the Weston A. Price stuff with the ferments and the bone broths. And I was making my own kombucha. And my kitchen looked like a little lab with my kombucha jars and my ferments. And so I was doing all those things, not knowing they were so high histamine. And my sleep just got so much worse that I ended up dependent on Benadryl for about 4 years. And I could only drift. I couldn't really sleep. And eventually I ended up bedridden. And by the time I was 20, I believe I was about 27, 28, I had to use a cane to walk about half of the time of the year. So I just kept making these circuits. Many times I thought I was going to die. And my joints were so painful. It was like I had ground glass in my joints. I eventually figured out histamine intolerance. And getting off the high histamine foods helped a good bit and got me kind of another level. But when I realized I had Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, all the light bulbs went off because finally everything made sense in how these things connected. My terrible sleep, the severe anxiety and panic attacks, the depression, the gut issues and chronic diarrhea, the acid reflux, itching and the sensitive skin. All of it fit together. I had interstitial cystitis and vulvodynia. I mean, it was just all of these systems, were involved. So then the journey was to figure out, okay, well, what's causing that mast cell activation syndrome? And that's where I really healed, was identifying those root pieces, putting them together, addressing them. And I've been off that cane for, I think, 6 or 7 years. I can go hiking, can go bike riding. I run this busy practice, all these things I never thought. So I was able to go back to graduate school. I didn't go to medical school because I didn't want to hurt my body, but I was able to become a naturopath and get my life back, which was huge for me.
So that time from, like you said, college, when you wanted to go to medical school and you it sounds like you willed your way through your undergrad to be able to just get through. So are we talking about roughly a 10-year period before you started to figure things out, and where you could actually make that leap to the mast cell activation syndrome? Is it about 10, 15 years, 10, 12 years, something like that?
Well, if we start at 18, so at that point I was responsible for my own health and I was taking myself to practitioners. It was probably more about 15, maybe 16 years of being, and I was really ill as a child even. I never had energy. I didn't have energy like kids did. I had to drag myself out of bed just to get to high school. And it was a long time. And with people with these, what are considered mystery conditions, often have the same story. I hear it every week. I've seen 30 practitioners, 40. I stopped counting at 50.
Yeah.
What I'd seen.
It's really, really sad. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are going to relate to something like this. Maybe if it's not mast cell activation syndrome, it could be something else. And I know I talk with thyroid patients all the time, and that is absolutely their story. They've been, just feeling horrible for years and years and years, but they're always told everything is normal, like what you were saying in the beginning. So for the listeners, can you please describe or tell us what mast cell activation syndrome is, and then describe some of the symptoms?
Well, I want to start by saying that if people are listening to this, probably 1 in 2 have mast cell activation syndrome.
Wow.
So in the chronically ill population, it's affecting 50% or more. Anyone with autoimmunity, anyone with multi-systemic symptoms that, don't have a specific cause, that's likely what's connecting the dots. And even in the general population studies, we're looking at 9 to 17% of the general population, which is huge. So this is one of the most under-recognized conditions out there. So what this is, the mast cells are immune cells, and they're part of the front line sensing and defending cells of the immune system. And so if we think about it in terms of a Th1 and Th2 immune response, so we know the Th1 response is that pathogen killing bacteria, killing viruses. Th2 is the chronic inflammatory side that kicks in if the Th1 side isn't getting rid of the infection. What happens is when we have these underlying triggers that we'll talk about, that Th2 side keeps going up. So we get all this chronic inflammation. And when that happens, Th1 side comes down and we can't kill things off anymore. So either people are getting sick frequently, or they tell me that they never get sick, but that's not a good thing because that means they're just not getting the symptoms. Their immune system isn't launching the attack against a virus or bacteria, which causes those kinds of cold symptoms or flu symptoms. So these mast cells are I think of them as very intelligent cells, in that they have hundreds of receptors on the outside, so they can sense and respond to all kinds of things in our environment, where we're talking about a virus, a bacteria, molds, or yeast, or we're talking about parasites, but also different kinds of toxins and electromagnetic fields. So anything coming into an environment, perfumes, essential oils, anything like this, they're going to sense. And then they have over 1,000 different mediators inside them that they can release depending on what's happening. So most common experience of this mast cell response is having a splinter stuck in your hand or a little piece of glass. If you don't get it out, then it starts to get red, it starts to get itchy. That's the mast cells surrounding that area with inflammation to protect the body. And to
so that's when inflammation is good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we need those mast cells to survive. They're critical. And they're sensing that bacteria on the splinter, they're sensing the injury, they're creating some inflammation to call to the rest of the immune system to come in, clean up the bacteria, but also heal the injury. And those are some of the roles in the body. They're found in almost every tissue in the body. And so that's why it makes it so hard for traditional medicine to figure out this is what's going on, because we have this reductionistic traditional medicine system. And that's where people with mast cell activation syndrome, we're the ones that are falling through the cracks. We're the ones going person to person. And there's a big thyroid connection that we'll talk about. with this, but we find the mast cells in the entire nervous system in the brain, in the entire GI tract. They completely line the GI tract, around the eyes, in the sinuses, the bladder, the genitals, completely throughout the skin, the heart, and the blood vessels. So you name it, there are very few tissues. A few things are like the cornea. We don't have mast cells in the cornea, but
Okay.
all of the tissues, inside around the eyes. And then when they get chronically triggered, and we live in such a toxic world right now, and we have massive mold exposures that we've never had before, and we have all these electromagnetic fields, all of this stuff comes together. It's hard to find products at a grocery store that don't have fragrance in them, which are carcinogenic, they're hormone disruptors, they're mast cell triggers. So we're chronically stimulated. And I think of them like being the guards of the castle gate for our bodies. And so guards of the castle gate should get to do an 8-hour shift and then take a break.
Mm-hmm.
But our mast cells and the world that we live in are doing 24/7 shifts, never getting a break because they're always being triggered. And then they start to get wonky and they get overactivated. So you can think about if somebody was in a battle zone 24/7, they get PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what happens with our mast cells. And instead of shooting at the enemies and letting the friendly things in and the things that are good for us in, they can start shooting at butterflies. And we get people with all kinds of unusual reactions. They react to supplements when you wouldn't think they would. They react to medications. I've had people who react to water.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's that can be pretty intense, so when you consider why this is happening, so I'm assuming that it's increasing because of all the chemicals and the, like you said, the EMFs and the other things that we're exposed to on a regular basis more commonly than we used to be. I'm assuming that's why this condition is increasing, or is there more to that than that?
Well, it's exactly that. So we're eating a lot of junk foods now, and our foods sit. So they sit in the shelves. We have a lot of processed foods. So those are going to increase in histamine. And histamine is the best known mast cell mediator. And there are a couple other immune cells that make histamine. The mast cells make a lot of histamine. And then there's all of these others as well that can make prostaglandins and cytokines. And that's a big word that a lot of people know now.
Mm-hmm.
And those cytokines are made by mast cells when we're talking about things like cytokine storms.
Right.
So we have the food triggers. We have a big epidemic of mold toxicity, and that's the number one trigger that I see that kicks this off for people. And then we have things like chronic Lyme and Epstein-Barr. We have nutrient deficiencies, and even people eating healthy, our soils are so depleted, and then our food's truck so long that it's impossible to get enough vitamin C in our foods unless we're growing it or we're buying it locally. So we have those kinds of issues. There are genetic factors, there are hormone imbalances, and then stress and trauma, because the immune system and the nervous system, as well as the hormone system, are really an axis.
Right.
So chronic stress, mast cells can start to respond within seconds to an emotional stressor.
Well, it seems a little daunting, doesn't it? Where people are dealing with this, because they're, we can look at our lives and think, okay, what stresses can we remove from our life? And a lot of times people will say there's nothing that they can change. I mean, I hear that a lot. Nutrients, they'll say, I'm eating really healthy, so we have to look to these other things. So do you have sort of a way to identify the root triggers that are the best way to start with people? Or, it gets a little overwhelming if you're looking at all of the things we just talked about. So how do you sort of fine tune that and get into the nitty gritty with people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple ways. I always do this in the first appointment when I see people one-on-one, but there's a lot of people that, there's just one of me, and a lot of people need help. So I created a report that people can get, and they can just step through these root triggers and go, okay, that one sounds like me. I think I have that. This one sounds like me. No, maybe I don't have that one. And then they can take that list to their practitioner and say, hey, are we working on these? Because here's the thing is, it is daunting and it is complex. It took me over 20 years to figure this out and put this together. And a lot of practitioners don't have training in this because it's not taught in medical school. It just got a diagnosis code in 2016. So that's relatively new. And the diagnostic criteria is missing 90% of people with it because it's still evolving and it needs a lot of work. But that report will let people start to guide themselves through. And I'm actually going to have a master class and really dive into this with people as well, so they can jump into that and help themselves start to work on these root triggers, because we've got to get this information out.
Yeah, for sure. So if a diagnosis code just came out in 2016, and then the criteria, you said 90% of the criteria, or it misses 90% of the people who have this?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
And that's not just my opinion. I've confirmed that with other people working this field, and they're seeing the same thing. And the problem is, so the criteria is that you have to have symptoms in 2 or more systems. Okay, so you have digestive symptoms and trouble sleeping, or you can have itching and flushing, and then respiratory problems and trouble breathing, asthma, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have to have a positive marker in one of the blood tests for one of the mast cell mediators. So histamine or prostaglandins, tryptase, something like that. Problem with that is that with these blood tests, these mediators are up and down in our blood in like 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. So you got to catch it in the right moment, or you have to be really flared up. So there are practitioners that really need that diagnostic code for insurance coverage, and they're having their patients intentionally get flared up. And then sometimes if they can do the testing in office, they'll have people come and be there for 8 hours, and they'll test them every hour just to try to get a positive marker. So that's a problem.
Yeah, that is a problem. It shouldn't have to be that hard, but you can see, I was going to ask, how does this get diagnosed? Because I've never run into anybody with this diagnosis. The most that people are maybe have some awareness that they have a histamine intolerance, and that is about it. I've never seen anybody with this diagnosis, and now I know why.
And part of it is we've got a lot of miseducation, and particularly with allergists and immunologists. And I've seen the biggest problems coming out of those fields because they were taught that mast cell issues are extremely rare, which the mastocytosis is very rare, but this is very common. And then they were taught that, well, it has to be presented with itching, flushing, and that's not true. I have people in my practice. I have a woman who has no skin symptoms at all, but she has acid reflux, she has loose stools, she has depression, she has trouble sleeping, and she's got supplement sensitivities, chemical sensitivities. That's a slam dunk if you've ruled everything else out.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I'm, as we're talking, I have people in my mind that I've been working with where this could help them just a little bit more, or actually probably a lot of bit more for what they're feeling. So what is the link between mast cell activation and thyroid health?
Yeah, so this is really interesting to me. So the thyroid has mast cells in it. And what I found fascinating is that mast cells actually store T3, and they have receptors for TSH.
Wow.
Yeah. So the thyroid function is going to influence mast cell activation. And if we have too low or too high TSH, so we're trending towards hypo or hyperthyroidism, we can start to flare up mast cell activation. But also the mast cell activation is then going to impact the thyroid, because if the mast cells are getting triggered by imbalances in the thyroid hormone, they're going to start producing inflammatory compounds because they're launching an attack. They think, well, there must be an infection with the thyroid, or toxins. There's a lot of toxins that affect the thyroid. And then you get this kind of downward spiral of this co-triggering between the thyroid and the mast cells there. And then a lot of our root triggers for mast cell activation affect the thyroid. The majority of people in my practice have thyroid issues with mast cell activation. I'm always shocked if somebody does not have a thyroid issue when they come in.
Wow.
And so mold toxicity is a huge, huge one. And this is, again, the biggest root trigger I'm seeing in my practice. I think that's one of the biggest things that we're not recognizing and addressing. And there are solid studies showing how mold toxins can affect the thyroid and push it towards hypo or hyperthyroidism. Then we've got our chemical toxins like fragrances, and I know you know this area better than I do, but plastics and these kinds of things. Toxins from gut infections are going to affect the thyroid. And then also they're going to affect the mast cells. And then there are a lot of nutrient imbalances that if you don't have them affect, if you don't have those nutrients. So those are some of the links. And then one of the huge links are oxalates. So these are those tiny microscopic, they very sharp, they look like a razor blade or little shards of glass, depending on what kinds of oxalates they look like that under a microscope. And they're in some of the foods we think of as so healthy. They're very, very high in spinach and beets and almonds, and rhubarb and Swiss chard are some of the top oxalate foods. And those oxalates can lodge in the thyroid and cause a lot of thyroid damage, and they also trigger mast cell activation. So we have a lot of this co-activation. And we have that stress axis we talked about before.
Right.
And the hormone link with the immune system, the nervous system.
So when you say you're surprised when people come in to your practice and they don't have a thyroid issue, that's surprising to you. When you say thyroid issue, are you seeing more Hashimoto's or Graves' autoimmune thyroid conditions, or are you seeing more hyper or hypo, like more of the, without the autoimmune part of it?
Yeah, I see a lot of times, and I don't diagnose myself, but people have been diagnosed when they come in.
Right.
According to with their thyroid issues. So I see a lot more hypothyroidism and then Hashimoto's. Very small amount of Graves. Maybe I've got 2 or 3 people. They're dealing with Graves, and a small amount of people with hyper, but much more trend towards that hypo side.
That's kind of what it makes sense for what you were saying about it being, with T3 and the mast cells and the TSH and the gut and all the connections with that thyroid health is pretty crazy. So all the inflammation that people deal with thyroid health, I think of right away the gut health and thyroid, and obviously with the inflammation part, the autoimmune component. And what I see is, so you're getting people that have a diagnosis already. I see people who have, quote unquote, normal thyroid lab tests. And so it's really hard for people to get a full panel drawn. I talk about this all the time. I swear it comes up on every episode that they don't get a full panel. So they look like they're, have normal thyroid for so many years. So are these people that you've been working with and then they've been diagnosed outside of this, like with your help, guiding them to find someone to help them get a decent thyroid panel, or how does that work for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sometimes people come in with that full panel, not usually.
Yeah.
And then I'll either ask them to go back to their practitioner and go ahead and get the T4, the reverse T3, and very rarely are people running antibodies, which is a big problem.
Yeah.
So I'm always requesting, I want to see all of those along with the TSH and the T3. And I've had a number of people who go take it to their practitioner and say, hey, can you get this for me under insurance? And they say, no, we can't because your TSH is normal.
Yeah.
And it's like, and the problem and the range, the lab range is such a problem because their lab range is not normal, in my opinion. It's certainly not optimal.
No,
and those ranges are based off of studies of the general Western population, which is not a healthy population, and then taking the 5% on each end as being abnormal. That's completely skewed. I mean, you couldn't get away with doing that in a peer-reviewed research journal that, is really has a good reputation. Like you couldn't do that and call that, unhealthy population and make your range off of that. And,
right.
And then say, well, that should be the optimal range for everybody.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense. And I know for my thyroid story and being tested for so many years, I was in that normal range. And I actually in the functional range, even I would have been just a little bit outside of that for many, many years. But we all know that window can be really, really small to where people actually feel their best. And I was probably, a point off of that. But when I first started dealing with, dealing with thyroid cancer, the range was so big. It was so big. And now I'm seeing when people bring in their lab results, the range has shrunk by 1.5. So where it used to go up to 5 and sometimes 5.5, I used to see for TSH. And now I see more in that 3.5 range as the top end of normal, which is good to see. But I still see people who are at a 3, in that 4. I've seen people at 6 and 8, and they're not getting any help or treatment. They have every classic symptom in the book, according to everything else I read and my own experience and everybody else's experiences, but they don't fall into that, or out of the range enough to get help. So that can just set them up for, chronic inflammation and stress to their body and, the mast cell aspect of thif
Exactly. And even in my opinion, TSH of 3 is still too high. And if somebody has thyroid cancer, if they have Graves, that needs to be addressed. Or if they have significant Hashimoto's, if the markers are out of range, I do find that if we work on these root causes, then the thyroid and the body itself wants to heal. And so, especially with the mold toxicity, and I just keep coming back to it because it's something that shocks so many people when I say most people in my practice have mold toxicity. And you ask somebody, and they, do you have mold in the house? Everybody's going to say no. I don't see any mold. I don't smell any mold. And they say, well, what about in the basement? Is there musty smell? Well, it's kind of a funny smell. Does it smell like an antique store? Does it smell musty? Yeah, kind of in this corner. Okay, you have mold. Or I'll ask people, well, what is the humidity run in your house? And most people don't know. So I have them get these little gauges that you can pick up, and they're not expensive. And then most people tell me, oh, well, it's like 65%. The mold inspector said that was fine. But if you have just humidity above 50%, you're going to have mold growth, hands down. And it's become a real issue because the mold experiences electromagnetic fields coming off of our Wi-Fi routers, our laptops, our cell phones, and all of this, experience it as a threat. So when mold is under threat, it produces hundreds of times more spores and more toxins. And studies are showing 600 times faster mold growth and spore production and toxin production in the presence of Wi-Fi. So that's huge. And we haven't even explored how much faster it's growing in our body. So that's why we have this epidemic of mold toxicity that is underlying a lot of the challenges that we're seeing. And that's the first thing that I address if people have that and they have this kind of stack of things, unless there's a critical medical issue like the thyroid cancer, of course.
Sure. So I was going to ask that, why is there so much more mold toxicity? We didn't hear about this, I feel like, or at least I didn't 5 years ago. I mean, occasionally you hear about mold allergies, which those are my strongest allergies, environmental allergies, but that's what you mostly hear about, but not necessarily mold toxicity. So you just explained why it's so much more common, or maybe one of the worst things for our health. Now, how do you determine the level of mold toxicity? Is it more on an intake form, or can you actually test people for this? Or how do you do this?
Yeah, I want to step back for just a second. 2 other components around why mold has become an issue.
Okay.
When I was growing up, living in a mold toxic house was not a good thing. But most people were living in houses that were same kind of conditions as what we're seeing now. They didn't have mold issues. So I think the Wi-Fi routers were a big thing. But what that's compounding are 2 other factors. One, we build houses tighter than we used to because in the 1970s, the buildings code changed for energy saving reasons. So we wrap the houses in Tyvek. And if it rains before they get the external material put onto the house, whether you're talking about siding or brick or whatever, you just locked all that moisture in. And this is frequently happening in building practices. Even without that, the houses are so tightly wrapped, humidity gets trapped in the walls and in the house in general. And we don't have fresh air exchange like we used to. And so we keep the windows closed, or we're in high pollution areas like here in Cincinnati. We're in one of the most top 10 polluted cities. So I've got to choose, stale air in the house or polluted air outside. So we had to install a dehumidifier, a fresh air exchange, air filters, all of this to deal with that. So that's one thing. Then we use all these fungicidal paints, to kill off molds, but they're only strong enough to kill off the weak molds. So the really toxic molds have a better foothold and they're not out competing. The weak molds aren't out competing. So we have this kind of 3-factor effect going on. So to look at mold toxicity with somebody, and this is huge in thyroid issues, I think next to gluten, this is like as big as gluten for people with thyroid issues. And one is a health history, because people can have mold exposure like I did in my childhood. So you can have mold exposure in your childhood. And if it colonizes in your body, or you just have the toxins in your body and your detox systems aren't optimal, so you can't get rid of it, it can stay with you. And I've seen people who, it gets stored in the fat tissue.
Right.
And I've seen people who were overweight and they did some rapid weight loss. They felt okay. And then with the rapid weight loss, they got horribly sick because all those toxins came flooding out. So that's one piece, is the health history. I look at the symptoms that correlate, and some of the telltale symptoms are a lot of chemical sensitivity, supplement sensitivity, food sensitivity, ice pick kind of pains, or lightning bolt kind of pains. These are very, very unique to mold toxicity because of how significantly it dysregulates the nervous system. You get this weird nerve kind of firing. And I used to have just odd pains as a child. And my pediatrician always said, well, they're growing pains, you'll grow out of it. It's like, well, I didn't grow out of it until I got rid of the toxins. So those are some of it. And we'll often see this kind of things, health issues start to pile up. So they'll get SIBO or other gut issues, and then they'll start to get thyroid issues. They'll get estrogen dominance and these kind of hormone imbalances, sleep issues, and it just stacks and stacks. Then the other ways to look at it are, can do blood antibody testing. And can we pause? Sorry. So then if we want to look at mold toxicity in somebody and actually confirm that, then there are a few different methods. There are a few different schools of thought around it. So there are different markers that people can look at in the blood, but they're not specific to mold. So I personally don't find them as useful, although other people do. You can do antibody testing for mycotoxins, and that can be a way to look at it. And then my favorite way is to look at urine mycotoxins and how it's excreted. And that shows us which levels are the highest and what the body's getting rid of. Doesn't show us the total load though, because we have to think about what we're testing. It only shows us what we're being able to release through the urine. So it helps if people can do some sweating or take a very small amount of glutathione beforehand to kind of mobilize those toxins out of the fat tissues. And then we start addressing it based on which toxins are the highest. So for example, ochratoxin is the most common one. So if that's the highest, then we would start with making sure that somebody wasn't constipated, so you can eliminate, they drink enough water. We've done the research now that we can really target the binders for which toxins, which bind better, and which phase 2 detox supports. So we can customize this in a way. And I was on a team that did the research on this. It was really interesting to dig into. And we can personalize it. And it's the first time we've been able to do that. So we're just getting that information out to practitioners this year.
That's very cool, because I think that is a part of my programs is detoxification, helping optimize that. But I'm looking at it, of course, from more the nutrition aspect of it, so that people can, optimize how their liver is going through each phase and that kind of thing. And you need, certain nutrients to do that. And then you need an environment too that is not keeping and bombarding the system down. So having that information would be amazing. I just wanted to pick that up because what you said was so important.
that people have to make sure they're not in a toxic environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen a lot of people try to get through a mold detox protocol and they just keep reacting, or they're never feeling better. And when I really drill into it, they're still exposed to mold. And if we're still exposed to mold, we just can't get a hold of the game. And it's actually challenging to find a place that's mold free if you live in anywhere, I think on the like outskirts, outside of the desert.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the desert, you can have mold issues if there are pipe leaks, or people have things like evaporative coolers that are blowing air over water.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just everywhere.
Yeah, I notice when this is I mean, I won't know for sure. I will never know for sure. But when I used to teach, I used to teach in a high school. And when I first started teaching there, it was brand new building. It was brand new, you know, brick and mortar. And, you know, I would get sick often. I mean, I had a history of getting sinus infections and that kind of thing. So that part wasn't new. But I noticed there was a time where I would be walking into the building. By the time I come into the faculty door and walk quite a far away to my classroom, I would have a headache. You know, is almost as soon as I got into the building. From the time I opened the door from the outside and got to my classroom, I had a headache. And so I noticed then when I had stopped working there, and then I'd go back and I would do some subbing, if I was there for 3-4 days in a row, still again, then I would start getting sinus and sore throat, and you know, then I would have headaches if I was there for any length of time whatsoever. And I just always thought to myself, it's got to be mold. I don't know if there's any reality to that, but when you talk about the building process, I think of that when we built our house. After we moved in, the builder brought in a couple different dehumidifiers and just ran them constantly, told them to run them constantly to get all the moisture out of the building process. He said, you got to get that out. And it's code here to do air exchangers. So that was really helpful, but I would not know that a house would hold that much moisture. I would not ever think of that. And, you know, to your point, they wrap it up to keep it waterproof, and then that moisture sticks in there and it's not going away. So mold can set in even in a new structure.
Absolutely. So, I've had people that built brand new houses. I've had people who built $1 million houses. Mm-hmm. And then there was mold in the walls. And you were spot on with the school. I've had so many teachers and principals and kids. And part of the other problem with the buildings is that we close up schools during the summer, mm-hmm. and turn the AC off to save energy and to save money. But when that AC is off and everything's closed up, there's no air exchange, you get that humidity buildup, you get mold. And some of the worst are the portable buildings. I've had some of my sickest kids were kids that were in the outdoor portable buildings.
That's interesting. And what do you do? I mean, those kids are sitting in there 8 hours a day. Right. And, you know, taking in all that mold. That's
scary. Church, they have to think about their workspace. They have to think about other places they spend a lot of time. Like I have people that they feel good at home, but then they go take care of their parents. And when they're at their parents' house, and you know, maybe they're there 4 or 5 hours a mm-hmm. week, then that's keeping them sick.
Yeah. So then what do you do? I mean, what are the steps to help heal this? If, you know, you can't not go to your teaching job, or you can't not go take care of your parents, or, you know, all these situations. So how do we combat this without completely uprooting everything in our lives?
Well, I think one, it depends on how significant the mold is. Mm-hmm. And if it is significant in the school, then the health department needs to be alerted, and it really needs to be cleaned up, because you're mm-hmm. talking about, you know, potentially hundreds of kids being exposed there. If it's at a parent's house, there may be some easy things to do to get it cleaned up. If it's at a workplace, and I had somebody who told me that she got sick when she started a particular job, and they had to come in and do something in the drop ceiling above her. And when they pulled mm-hmm. it down, it was just full of mold in that area. Well, that's a health hazard. That has to be addressed. Yeah. If it's just kind of normal levels of mold, but somebody's more sensitive, when they go through a protocol, they're usually going to be a little bit better. They're going to tolerate it. I mean, they're going to feel much better. It's a game changer. They're going to tolerate mold somewhat better, but probably not ever the same as somebody who's never had mold toxicity. because our immune system remembers, and it's going to go into danger mode
Right.
if we're back in there. But there is a lot that we can do, and making sure that our homes are clean spaces to be in terms of our air quality, our water quality is huge. And then I have everybody start with nervous system supports. Again, because we get this nervous system dysregulation, and that's a way we can start to calm the immune system down without bringing supplements on board yet. It's not, of course, the whole thing. We have to get it all out. But there are these key steps, and I've written about them on my blog if anybody wants to get into more depth on it. I've really gone into a lot of information. One of the other keys is when people do a protocol, whether we're talking about for thyroid health, we're talking about for mast cell activation, whatever, and there are solid research on mold toxins in every form of bowel disease like Crohn's and colitis and all kinds of cancers is extremely carcinogenic. We've got to continue with the protocol until the toxins are completely out of the system. And then usually for about 3 months after that. So you repeat the testing to make sure it's gone. And because of the carcinogenic effects, it's so critical for people to do that if it's in their health history.
So I realize that everyone is different in the different levels of toxicity, but is there sort of a general timeline that you see where people can actually go through these protocols and get rid of the toxicity, or to the degree that you're comfortable with for them moving forward with, maybe the supplement protocol or whatever it is that you end up by doing? Is there sort of a timeline?
Yeah, it depends on a few factors. So one big factor is age. Children bounce back much faster. Most of the time, children don't have the sinus colonization or the gut colonization. So they may just need binders.
Okay.
And I've seen kids go from daily anaphylaxis from eating things like carrots to, which are low histamine, should be fine, right?
Yeah, right.
To, in about 4 months, being able to eat most of the things they want and really bounce back quickly. The younger, the faster they bounce back if they get out of the mold. Then another factor is how long was somebody exposed? And so how much toxicity is there? How sensitive is this person? So how much can they take supplement wise? How slowly we have to go? And I just happen to see the most sensitive of sensitive people, where sometimes we have to do a little sprinkle every 3rd day. But somebody who's got a stronger system, they can just start with a half capsule or a capsule of charcoal or whatever we're using and build up. And so it just depends. And then what else do they have going on? And how slowly do we have to go? I've seen as short as 6 months. I had significant amount of exposure because I had exposures also after I left that farmhouse. Lived in a 100-year-old duplex when I was in college. I was renting at a workspace in the basement of this historic building built in the 1850s. I didn't know there was mold till I took my stuff off the walls and the plaster just crumbled and I felt it was wet behind there. So that didn't help me.
No.
So my protocol took about 4 years. I'm still wrapping it up here.
Sure. Okay. It's very interesting. I just can't even, I'm just kind of blown away with the mast cell activation diagnosis and how that's so difficult, and then how the mold is just getting to be so much more common. I mean, I know we talked about that in kind of depth, but I'm just so surprised by that. I guess I don't know why I am, but it's probably been out there for a while. I just feel like it's that last thing when I'm working with people. I shouldn't say last thing, it should be the first thing, but I feel like it's a missing link that for a few of my people, I'm just thinking, like I said, I'm thinking about people as we're talking, and it's like, gosh, these are some of the things that we can dig in deeper. Like I mentioned before we even started, when we were talking before we were recording, that I deal with a lot of people with histamine intolerance, but I feel like I know that there's more to it than that, and this is absolutely where I would be going with those people, for sure. So I really appreciate the information. You had mentioned your free report, and I just I'll put this on the show notes, but how can we get people to get to this free report to just get this kind of assessment of what's going on with their mast cells, and then what other links do you have for us to be able to access your information?
Sure. So our website's at mastcell360.com. So for people listening, it's M as in Mary, AST as in Tom, cell360.com. Well, tons of information on the blog. The report that you talked about, they can just find it at mastcell360.com/free report. I've got a class up there on how to get started with supplements for people with mast activation. We're going to launch the root causes class, and I'm going to keep rolling these out because there's so many people that need help, and it is complex in terms of there are a lot of pieces, but people can do it. And I want people to take away that if this is what's going on for you, there is so much hope. There is so much that we can turn around. And I do see some of the sickest people, and a lot of people aren't as ill as I was, or as a lot of people in my practice are. But whether somebody's bedridden or, they're just sluggish and they don't feel well and they're, having flushing and their eyes are swelling when they eat or things like that, whatever constellation of symptoms, there's a lot that can be done. And people can turn this around. We don't have to just accept it. And the traditional medical perspective is that, well, you have to live with it. You have to take a lot of medications, and it's going to continue to get worse over time. It's degenerative. It doesn't have to be. It's degenerative if on meds, because the meds are going to mask the symptoms and the root issues are going to continue to escalate. And that's why I got so sick too, was I was put on a lot of meds, and that's all I had. That's all we knew.
Right. And you're just told to kind of deal with your new normal,
Right. Exactly.
The new normal, which is the worst thing to hear in my opinion, but it's one of those things that just seems so defeating. Like there's nothing you can do with that, And so that's what you're doing for people. You're giving them hope, you're giving them options, and it doesn't have to be this way.
Exactly. And you don't have to do it alone.
Right.
We also have free Facebook Lives almost every Monday.
Awesome.
And a different topic around this every week. And so people can jump on there, and our Facebook page is just Mast Cell 360. Lots of free info. And we have just a great community, a lot of engagement. People are really nice to each other. They help each other out. And I love the community that we have there.
That's great. So all that will be in the show notes for everybody to access. So anyway, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate this information. It's so important to get this out. Like you said, it's really necessary to help the people out because it's so common. And it's just nice to know that there is people like you that will do this, and the resources available to everybody is amazing. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Tiffany. And I'm so glad we can team up to help the kind of people that we help, and we can bring this information to them.
Yes, it's awesome. Thank you so much. Bye.